What if the most important economic story of the last century is not the rise of the United States, not the collapse of the Soviet Union, but the quiet, methodical transformation of a country that, within living memory, was overwhelmingly poor? In 1978, China contributed roughly 2% to global GDP. More than 90% of its population lived in extreme poverty by international standards. Agricultural output was unreliable. Industrial productivity was weak. Per capita income was lower than many sub-Saharan African countries at the time. Today, China accounts for more than 18% of global GDP. It is the world's second largest economy in nominal terms and the largest in purchasing power parity. It is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. It dominates global manufacturing, leads in renewable energy production, and competes at the frontier of artificial intelligence, telecommunications, and electric vehicles. This is not gradual convergence. This is systemic acceleration. And the real question is not how China grew fast. The real question is how a political system built on central control engineered one of the most dynamic market expansions in modern economic history, without collapsing under its own contradictions. To understand this transformation, we have to begin with collapse. For much of pre-modern history, China was one of the world's leading economies. Its civilizational identity, Zhongguo, the Middle Kingdom, reflected a worldview in which China was not peripheral, but central. It pioneered technologies such as paper, gunpowder, and printing. It maintained sophisticated administrative systems when much of Europe was still fragmented. But by the 19th century, that equilibrium broke. The Opium Wars forced open China's markets under unequal treaties. Western powers extracted concessions. Internal rebellions destabilized the Qing dynasty. Industrialization lagged, sovereignty eroded. The period from 1839 to 1949 is often referred to in China as the century of humiliation. It ended with the communist victory in the Civil War and the establishment of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong. What followed was radical restructuring. Land was collectivized. Private enterprise was eliminated. Central planning dictated production quotas. The Great Leap Forward in 1958 attempted to force industrialization through mass mobilization. Backyard steel furnaces became symbolic of the effort. The economic consequences were catastrophic. Grain output declined sharply. Incentives collapsed. Between 1959 and 1961, famine claimed tens of millions of lives. Estimates range from 20 to 40 million deaths. This was not simply policy failure. It was a breakdown of information flow. Local officials overstated production to meet political expectations. Central planners misallocated resources. Feedback loops were distorted by fear. A few years later, the Cultural Revolution disrupted education, industry, and governance. Universities closed. Skilled professionals were persecuted. Institutional capacity weakened further. By the time Mao died in 1976, China was unified but economically stagnant. Per capita income was extremely low. Productivity was constrained. The country was largely isolated from global markets. Then came a pivot that changed everything. Deng Xiaoping did not reject socialism. He reinterpreted it. His approach was pragmatic, experimental, and cautious. Instead of dismantling the system overnight, he adjusted the incentives within it. The first major reform targeted agriculture. Under Mao, farming had been collectivized into large communes. Individual households had little control over output. Deng introduced the household responsibility system. Land remained state-owned, but families received long-term usage rights. They were required to deliver a quota to the state, but any surplus could be sold on the market. This single reform reintroduced incentives without privatizing land outright. The effect was immediate. Agricultural productivity surged in the early 1980s. Rural incomes rose. Food shortages diminished. For the first time in decades, farmers had a direct stake in output. In macroeconomic terms, this reform unlocked latent productivity trapped under rigid planning. The next phase extended to industry. State-owned enterprises were granted greater autonomy. Managers could retain a portion of profits. Wage bonuses linked compensation to performance. While ownership remained public, operational flexibility expanded. Then came one of the most consequential policy experiments in modern economic history: special economic zones. Beginning in 1980, cities like Shenzhen were designated as zones where market mechanisms could operate with fewer restrictions. Foreign investment was encouraged, tax incentives were offered, infrastructure was prioritized. Shenzhen is perhaps the clearest illustration. In 1980, it was a modest fishing community near Hong Kong. Within decades, it transformed into a metropolis of over 10 million people and a global manufacturing hub. This was not organic urban growth. It was engineered integration into global supply chains. Multinational corporations relocated labor-intensive production to China. Low wages, disciplined labor, improving infrastructure, and supportive policy created a powerful manufacturing ecosystem. Export volumes expanded rapidly. By the early 2000s, China was no longer just assembling products. It was embedding itself at multiple stages of production. In 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. This was a structural inflection point. WTO accession required tariff reductions and regulatory adjustments, but it also guaranteed market access to global consumers. Exports accelerated, trade surpluses widened, foreign exchange reserves accumulated, eventually exceeding $3 trillion. The compounding effect of sustained growth at near double-digit rates for 3 decades is difficult to overstate. Hundreds of millions of people moved from rural areas to cities. Urbanization rose dramatically. Infrastructure development, ports, highways, power plants, high-speed rail expanded at unprecedented scale. But here is where the deeper structural layer emerges. China's rise was not purely market-driven nor purely state-driven. It was hybrid. Local governments were incentivized to pursue growth. Officials were evaluated based on GDP performance. This created intense interregional competition for investment. Provinces raced to build industrial parks, attract foreign firms, and expand output. Growth became a political performance metric. This alignment between political incentives and economic expansion produced extraordinary momentum. But it also created imbalances. Investment as a share of GDP rose to unusually high levels, often above 40%. Real estate became a major growth driver. Land sales financed local government budgets. Credit expansion supported construction booms. The 2008 global financial crisis tested the system. As demand from the United States and Europe contracted, China faced the risk of a sharp slowdown. The government responded with a stimulus package worth roughly 4 trillion yuan, focused heavily on infrastructure and construction. Growth rebounded quickly, but debt levels increased. The model leaned further toward investment-driven expansion. Meanwhile, wages were rising. The labor cost advantage that fueled early export growth was narrowing. China began shifting toward higher-value manufacturing, electronics, machinery, renewable energy components. Investment in education and research intensified. By the 2010s, China was spending over 4% of GDP on research and development, approaching levels seen in advanced economies. It produced more engineering graduates annually than any other country. The country moved from being the world's factory to aspiring to become a technology leader. Under Xi Jinping, the state has reasserted stronger oversight in strategic sectors. Technology companies have faced regulatory scrutiny. Capital flows have been monitored more closely. The government emphasizes common prosperity, attempting to address inequality. This raises a structural tension. Innovation thrives on experimentation and openness. Political systems prioritize stability and control. China attempts to balance both. Now consider the global dimension. China is the largest trading partner for over 120 countries. Its supply chains stretch across Asia, Africa, Europe, and Latin America. The Belt and Road Initiative extends infrastructure financing across continents. At the same time, strategic competition with the United States has intensified. Technology, export controls, semiconductor restrictions, and supply chain diversification efforts reflect rising geopolitical friction. The global economy is no longer unipolar. It is increasingly shaped by the interaction between two massive economic systems with different institutional models. But beyond geopolitics, the human dimension remains central. Since 1980, more than 800 million people in China have been lifted out of extreme poverty, according to World Bank estimates. This is one of the largest poverty reduction episodes in history. Urban households experience rising incomes, improved housing, expanded education, and broader access to healthcare. Consumer markets expanded. A middle class emerged numbering in the hundreds of millions. Yet inequality widened between coastal and inland regions. Environmental degradation accelerated during high-growth years. Air pollution reached severe levels in major cities before regulatory tightening. In response, China became a global leader in renewable energy production. It dominates solar panel manufacturing and leads in electric vehicle output. The same industrial capacity that once powered coal expansion is now being redirected toward green technology. Demographics, however, present a new constraint. China's working-age population has begun to decline. The legacy of the one-child policy has created an aging society. A shrinking labor force means future growth must rely more heavily on productivity gains rather than sheer labor expansion. That, particularly in the property sector, poses additional risk. Real estate developers accumulated significant liabilities during expansion years. As housing demand stabilizes, the adjustment process becomes delicate. So what does this mean for the future? China is transitioning from high-speed growth to high-quality growth. That is the official framing. In economic terms, it means shifting from investment-heavy expansion toward consumption, innovation, and services. But structural transitions are rarely smooth. The key question is whether China can sustain innovation while maintaining political centralization. Can it manage financial risk without stifling private sector dynamism? Can it increase household consumption enough to rebalance growth away from exports and heavy industry? These are not short-term fluctuations. They are long-term structural tests, and here is the broader implication. China's rise has permanently altered the distribution of global economic power. In 1978, global supply chains were centered in North America, Western Europe, and Japan. Today, East Asia, anchored by China, is a core manufacturing and trade hub. The smartphone in your hand, the laptop on your desk, the solar panels powering grids across continents, these are embedded in production networks, shaped by China's transformation. Understanding this story is not about ideology, it is about systems. China did not abandon state control entirely. It did not fully embrace free markets either. Instead, it experimented. It adjusted incentives. It opened selectively. It scaled relentlessly. The result was 4 decades of compounding growth that reshaped the world economy. Whether that model remains sustainable in the coming decades will depend on how flexibly it adapts to demographic decline, technological competition, financial risk, and geopolitical fragmentation. But one fact remains undeniable. In less than half a century, China moved from economic marginality to structural centrality in the global system. That shift is not temporary. And any serious analysis of the 21st century economy must begin with a clear understanding of how it happened and what it means for the balance of power that defines our world today.